Hi, everyone. This is Professor Bowen-Moore. This lecture is about design movements. Now, this is not a design history course, but we do want to touch on some historical movements and trends, and how that influences design today, and just kind of get you thinking about ways that you can observe in your world, in your, daily existence, how these might influence what you see around you. So we're going to talk about a few design movements: Art Nouveau, modernism, and postmodernism. And I'd like to, for you to think about them not just as visual styles or looks. They were design movements, and we've got to keep in mind of this. These were design movements organized around specific ideas. So they're reactions to their cultures. They're founded specifically on aesthetic and belief systems. So, but we want to look at some history first also. So before the Industrial Revolution, it's kind of hard to imagine, but about what life was like. But nothing was mass produced. We've got to think about everything was hand printed, handmade. Artisans created pretty much everything by hand: furniture, jewelry, tools, anything that had use, or even for ornamental decoration. But only 10% of the European population worked in villages. The rest usually farmed land. And this particular image here is the opening manuscript um, of Marcus Oriveto. It was from Italy in 1300, but hand printed. When they used gold, they used real gold leaf, um, which makes a lot of these books really not only valuable because of the artisanship and the detail put into these works, but also the materials were really hard to find and rare. So Johann Gutenberg, you've probably heard of him before. He was born in Mainz, Germany around 1397, but he's, started his working life as a merchant. He moved back, um, or he moved into the world of being a blacksmith and a goldsmith. He was very crafty. He was familiar with the craft of being a goldsmith and dye maker. And at the time, Mainz was a cultural and commercial center. This was during the Renaissance. There was this thirst for knowledge, and traditional handwritten manuscripts really couldn't satisfy the need for what people wanted at the time. So they were hard to put together. They were made to order, very expensive, very labor intensive. And scribes would copy from another book or usually had someone read it to them. So this could lead to many errors that were hard to correct. And adding to that was the scarcity and high cost of vellum and parchment papers that were used. So what Gutenberg did was he created these letter forms to resemble that handwritten manuscript, and he chose very Gothic manuscript style. That was the local or the writing style of the local scripts at the time. He produced a 42 line Latin Bible around 1455. So Gutenberg's Bible consisted of two volumes. It had a total of pages of 1,286 pages. He printed 180 copies, but there's less than 50 known to exist today. But you can see how the first printing press that Johann Gutenberg invented, really changed the times. So this kind of became the very initial phase of an industrial revolution. Um, and what that influenced was the emergence of Art Nouveau. So no building materials such as glass, reinforced concrete, cast iron, and steel, those became available to Art Nouveau artists thanks to the Industrial Revolution, and the use of large glass surfaces and buildings and all that grew during the second part of the 19th century with the very big growing popularity of cast iron. But then artists started experimenting with expressive lines and linear patterns, patterns like Paul Gonquin and Maxfield Parrish. They began involving these fluid line movements and organic linear flows in their paintings instead of this hard-edged popularity of, industrial type materials. So when you look at, Art Nouveau art, a lot of it was plein air painting too, just like the Impressionists, getting into natural light and painting outside. But as you look through, some of these Art Nouveau pieces, think about the organic decorative style based on nature and natural forms. Think about those sweeping curves, loose flowing letter forms that were used in these posters. Some of these we still see today in restaurants and bars. And you'll recognize a very famous or very, still used today, but the GE logo, which was designed and first created in 1890 during this Art Nouveau age. And it hasn't changed at all, really. But after this, the early part of the 20th century, or the 1900s, we started to replace that historicism with innovation. And just like with any new idea, there's going to be a break with history. So this became an initial phase of the modern movement. So what modernists tended to, honor in their beliefs, modernists felt like traditional forms of art, like architecture, literature, religion, faith, social organization, daily life, all that was becoming outdated in the new economic, social, and political conditions. It was a fully industrialized world. So emerging into that, these modernists felt that traditional forms were outdated a little bit. So authority ruled. That was the number one thing. A second thing was they questioned the views of the previous traditional age. They poured, they thought the power of human beings to create, improve, and reshape their environment. We started seeing scientific knowledge and technology, even though very little at the time, but some of that started emerging. We had practical experimentation that helped that along. And then there was this idea of truth as objective. It simply meant that no matter what we believed to be the case, there was always going to be some things that were true and there were always going to be some things that were false. So looking at a different, the modern movement, we really look at the Bauhaus era. It was kind of the kickstart of the modern design movements. And it's a huge influence. It's a small genre, but it was operated in Germany is kind of where it started. We still use influence of Bauhaus, the movement, still today in many, many areas of daily life. But this was originally a school operated in Germany from 1919 to 1933. I think it's a museum now. But when you look at this, how different it is from Art Nouveau movement. We have this style that emphasizes pure geometry. It stresses clean, functional forms. If you look at some of these poster concepts, they're completely Bauhaus influenced. They are still influenced by earlier design movements to some degree, but it bridged that gap between fine and applied arts and emphasized functional graphic design. So form follows function, if you've ever heard that term. This is where it came from. And there's this belief that design principles should be founded rationally. So this is post World War I. And then as we move through that time, you can see other works kind of follow this genre description. You know, you have very clean functional forms here, very clean lines, very much geometric. Even with typefaces, we see universal, which is still used today. Very Bauhaus influenced. And everyday items. So this, you know, moving into industrial design, Bauhaus had a lot of effective ways in motivating these geometric designs into furniture and things like that. So this was the original school. You can see it's very geometric in its architecture. Um, and from an aerial view, it looks like a big question mark, but very geometric. As time went further, we started seeing a little bit of postmodernism emerging after World War I, World War II. And what postmodernism did was it started challenging that line between high and low culture. It started blurring those distinctions between fact and fiction, or even art and commerce. So you had this wild juxtaposition of old and new cultural styles. You had this rejection that rational thought is the answer to every social problem. And you also, you know, people in the postmodern, we're still in a postmodern age, by the way, but it embraced the paradox. For instance, Jurassic Park cast, you know, the movie Jurassic Park, it cast doubts about modern science, but it also, in its delivery and execution, it depends on technological wizardry. To execute its message. So it's, you know, we embrace that paradox between truth and myth. There are some really, really strong and really, really creative designers out there that I want you to know about. One of them is Paula Scher. She is one of the, you know, long-term designers at the Pentagram Collective in New York. She is one of my graphic design idols, but she did a lot of rebrands. She's designed a lot of things that you see every day. But one of the things that she did was the public theater rebranding. And it, you know, she did a lot of work over the years with them. And so what postmodernist design did was you know, again, we see the opposition to hierarchy. We emphasize diversity and fragmentation here. In the slides, this is a link to the rebranding story or the branding story of the public theater. If you would like to know more, it's very interesting. Also, one of the, you know, really good designs that and kind of aggressive typographical design style that we see during the postmodern age is kind of across several artists, but the Lou Reed album cover here in 1996. You started seeing a lot of that in the 90s, actually. But this album cover is a good example because there is, you know, organized chaos, if you will. And there's structure, but it depends on how you're playing around with those rules. There was a couple, oh, didn't mean to do that. There was a couple also that had that aggressive type style. They were married, Scott and Laurie Michaela. They had a lot of grunge style designs that are actually making a comeback these days. But Scott was a graphic designer, multimedia designer, and type designer. He designed the typeface Dead History, which is a postmodern typeface. He also created very aggressive work for clients like Apple, Nike, Sony. He's worked for Michael Jackson in the past on the Scream film titles like Fight Club, as well as like contemporaries like David Carson, who is another famous designer that I will show you in a minute. But he and his wife Laurie, she was also a graphic designer or is a graphic designer, created a design in residence or designer in residence, and they were also co-directors of the graduate program at Cranbrook Academy of Art in Michigan. David Carson is a pretty famous American graphic designer. He's renowned for magazine art director. He was also a professional surfer at one time, but he's known for his unique typographical style, as you can see on this cover of Ray Gun magazine. He took courses internationally for graphic design, but he became a director of numerous magazines, like Transworld Skateboarding. It had a sister publication, Transworld Snowboarding. He was hired by Ray Gun magazine, but he offered a lot of features in, New York Times, Newsweek over the years. But he created his own creative agency eventually and has been working for or began working for brands like Ray-Ban, Nike, Microsoft, Budweiser, Giorgio Armani, Levi's back in the 90s. His more recent clients include like AT&T, British Airways, Kodak, Mercedes. So in the most recent years, he's actively educated and lectured globally, but he is someone that is an interesting person to read about when it comes to modern design and postmodern design. But if we look at a comparison in general, like if we look at animation, for instance, Brim Natwick's animation on the left, which is in the modern era, he was trained under Gustav Klimt in the Vienna before moving to the States, but you can see this modern design, very geometric, very looks, very simple in design, but again, form follows function here. Very structured. Whereas in postmodern, you see the originally produced and animated and voiced by Seth MacFarlane, Family Guy. Very postmodern in its attempt, in its execution. So I want you to know a little bit about that. If you have any questions, please let me know. Thank you for listening.